So, when my husband Steve heard that I was preparing a talk on eternity, he asked me if I was going to tell you about special relativity. And in response to my totally blank stare, he took out a loaf of bread and started to slice it in an attempt to explain the concepts of space and time in special relativity to me. He lost me within the first couple of minutes. Despite his efforts at helping me to understand, this was well and truly beyond my grasp. And eternity is also a hard concept for our human minds to grasp. Like all of these attributes of God you've been studying, minds of God is knowable, but also ineffable. We can know something of him, but he is too great or extreme to be described in words, and there are aspects of him that are beyond our human experience and understanding. I've got a childhood memory of being quite disturbed by the thought of eternity. The idea that something could carry on without ending was rather unsettling to me. When I thought about eternity, it was usually a negative description of something going on for way too long. But all of these decades later, what's more apparent to me is how difficult it is to cope with life's transience, how time seems to pass more quickly with each year, and how pointless life might seem if everything came to an end. Even when people die at a ripe old age, life seems too short. And sweet moments in life can be bittersweet because we know they're going to end. When I step off the plane in Cape Town to see my family, I'm aware of both joyful reunions as well as the clock ticking towards when we'll be saying goodbye again. I've been doing a Proverbs study with Emma and Lou and a number of other women, and one of the key messages is that the fear or right reverence of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, so that when we know God more clearly, we become wise about how to live in his world. The Bible speaks of our eternal God as our refuge. It says that his love for Israel is eternal, that his word is eternal, that there is eternal glory ahead of us with eternal pleasure at his right hand. In Psalm 102, the psalmist talks about the difference between our Creator God and the rest of creation. He says, "In the beginning you laid the foundations of the earth, and the heavens are the work of your hands. They will perish, but you remain. They will all wear out like a garment. Like clothing, you will change them and they will be discarded. But you will remain the same, and your years will never end." So unlike everything else in our experience, God has no beginning and no end. He is outside of and not limited by time. He is at the same time the God of the past, the present, and the future. We, by contrast, live very fleeting lives. Our days are described as being like the evening shadow, and we wither away like grass. I'm struck by how quickly we can become ignorant and forgetful of the lives of our ancestors. I wonder how much you know about the lives of previous generations in your family trees. How much do you know about the lives of your great-grandparents or your great-great-grandparents? It can be quite humbling to recognize how quickly, sometimes it's within 1 or 2 generations, a human life falls into obscurity. We also have very time-bound, limited perspectives. When I think about this, the example that comes to mind is how, in my field of mental health, perspectives on understanding and treating mental health problems have shifted so dramatically over the past century. It's quite sobering to think of the thousands of people who went through frontal lobotomies in the 1940s. For those of you who don't know, it's where holes were drilled into skulls and needles were inserted into brains. And at that time, the perspective was that this was an effective and a legitimate treatment for schizophrenia and depression. now it's viewed as unethical and bad science. And I wonder what it is that we're doing in treating mental illness that we will abandon as unhelpful or unethical in 100 years' time. So our lives are very bound by our limited perspectives, and they're very fleeting. But not only is God outside of and not limited by time, but all of his actions happen at just the right time. The wisdom of Ecclesiastes tells us that for everything there's a season and a time. God is never early or late. He doesn't operate according to our timelines, and we often don't see the end of the story with life made beautiful within his time, not within ours. Job did not receive an explanation for his suffering, but thousands of years later, we benefit from knowing that his suffering was not a punishment or abandonment by God. And the account of his life and suffering is an ongoing source of comfort and encouragement to those of us who suffer. I want to think with you about 6 ways in which we can live unwisely in relation to time, and then 4 ways in which we can live wisely. So, firstly, the 6 ways in which we can live unwisely include living in the past, worrying about the future, wishing time away, acting as if time is too short, acting as if time is limitless, and being overly focused on the temporal. So living in the past. David Copperfield's fabulous creation of the character Miss Havisham, who could not move on from being jilted at the wedding altar and spent her life in her fading wedding dress, is a great example of someone who was stuck in the past. Less dramatically than that, we can live in the past by allowing difficult past experiences and disappointments to define who we are. We can ruminate about our if-onlys, and we can regret our past decisions. Or we can nostalgically long for what once was. Today in our staff meeting, Andy Cottingham was talking about people who live as if they're looking out of the back window of the car, rather than looking at the road ahead. I remember having an epiphany a few years ago that I was viewing my past unwise choices as being a bit like ignoring the directions on sat-nav, and thinking that at this point in my life journey, I was so far away from the A road of God's perfect plan for my life that it was the equivalent of traveling off grid with just no clear path at all. Clearly, there are consequences for unwise choices, but I love the way in which Joan Wilkin describes God as the great time redeemer, so that when we repent of our bad choices, we are assured of God's forgiveness and deliverance, and we are solidly back on the path of his blessing. So the second way we can live unwisely is to worry about the future. I've heard it said that to think ahead is to be human. To worry is to try to be superhuman. When we act as if we need to know what will happen in the future, we tend to become plagued with doubt and worry. And worry, which involves a preoccupation with the future, is the opposite of confidence and rest in the wisdom and control of our God, who knows all the days of our lives. We can wish time away. When life is challenging, it's really easy to want time to pass quickly. The past year and the ongoing restrictions to normal life are a case in point. Our wanting life to get back to normality can lead to our wishing time away and stop us from being open to what is possible in the here and now. And I think we can fall into this mentality in all sorts of ways. We can wish it to be the weekend rather than a Monday. We can wish it to be summer rather than the winter. We can wish to be finished with studies, or we can wish a challenging date in the diary to be over. Acting as if time is too short. There are not enough hours in the day. I wonder how often you've heard that said, or maybe even thought that yourself. I certainly can put my hand up to this one. I think we can live as if we don't have enough time, as if the time given to us by God is inadequate, and we can live as if we're in a time deficit. And this can pull us into habits of frantic busyness, overworking, and neglecting rest. On the other hand, we can act as if time is limitless, and we can live as if there's all the time in the world, and then we might squander what is a limited resource. And this might look like spending time on things that are of little worth or importance. We can fix our eyes on things that are temporal and become too preoccupied with the material circumstances of our lives, focusing on what will make for a more comfortable or happy or aesthetic life, and become overly focused on wanting to get rid of the things that are a source of discomfort to us. So if those are the ways in which we can live unwisely in relation to time, what about the ways in which we can live wisely? How does knowledge of God's eternality set us on the path of wisdom? So I'm going to offer some thoughts about trusting God with our time, living with gratitude, trusting God with our future, and setting our sights on eternity. So trusting God with our time. We can live knowing that God knows the exact number of our days, and that when we give our time to Him, He is able to accomplish His purposes within the span of our days. Jesus trusted God with His very brief 3 years of ministry, and He did that by only ever doing what His Father told Him to do. And this allowed for time for napping in a boat and heading off into the hills for prayer and rest. We can reclaim time from useless pursuits and employ it to the glory of God. Ephesians 5:15-16 says, "Be very careful then how you live, not as unwise, but as wise, making the most of every opportunity, because the days are evil." We can live with gratitude in the present. So the problem with living in the past or worrying about the future or wishing time away is that it's often at the cost of engaging with a bit of time that matters, how we live in the present. We can choose to live with gratitude for God's goodness today, being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. And we can trust God for our future. We can trust God with the uncertainties that lie ahead and rest in His sovereign control over our lives. And I think part of this is maintaining hope that God can redeem situations that are difficult. We can look out for the ways in which He's always doing something new, even in seemingly stuck situations. Finally, we can set our sights on eternity. I want to tell you a quick story about Corrie ten Boom. You may know of her. She was a wonderful Dutch woman who, with her father and sister, was taken into a concentration camp in the Second World War because of hiding Jewish families in her home. She survived this experience and she became what she referred to as a tramp for the Lord. She traveled the world talking about Jesus, even into her old age. And there's this wonderful story of her buying her multi-city air ticket from a travel agent. And the young agent looked at absolute amazement, with amazement at this elderly lady who was traveling the length and breadth of the world. And she said, "Can you tell me what your final destination is?" And Corrie ten Boom, never missing an opportunity to talk about Jesus, said, "My final destination is heaven." The travel agent said, "Excuse me, madam, can you spell that for me, please?" Heaven, Corrie spelled slowly. And when the travel agent noticed what she'd written, she started to smile and said, "Oh, that's not what I meant." Corrie smiled and says, "But I do. You don't have to write it down. I already have a ticket to heaven. About 2,000 years ago, someone paid the price for me so that I will go to heaven. His name is Jesus, and he paid the price when he died for my sins on the cross. So Jesus is the one who pioneers the trail to heaven for us. He pulls back the curtain so that we can get a glimpse of what is to come. He never lost sight of where he was headed, that exhilarating finish in and with God. And this allowed him to endure the worst suffering of all, bearing the shame of our sin and separation from God on the cross. It was because of the joy set before him. So Paul in 2 Corinthians 4 encourages us to see our hardships in life as a trouble that are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. So when we are flagging, we need to fix our eyes not on what is seen, but on what is unseen, since what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. One of Andy Cottingham's strengths is that he is future-oriented. He is someone who thinks beyond the scope of his lifetime, and his choices are shaped by what he can do now that will benefit the generations to come. And we too can set our sights on building up treasure in heaven and on bringing heaven to earth during our lifetime. We can invest our time and our energy on the people and the things that have eternal significance. And we can be encouraged that God can bring eternal results from our time-bound efforts. So that's all I wanted to share with you. I've offered a number of questions for our discussion, and they're more than we could possibly discuss in the available time. So I'm just going to suggest you pick the ones that capture your heart most.